Recording. All right. Everybody all right? Doing good? All right. So we're gonna start with last week I just kind of did a blanket map of like the ancient world and the church fathers and how things sort of divided. Most people don't know that there was sort of two different worlds in the early church fathers and the apostolic fathers. There's the Greek world and there's the Latin world. The Greek being the East and the Latin being the West. And the Greeks were very much into philosophy, and most of the Western church fathers, they spoke Latin and were mainly like lawyers and stuff. So let me move some stuff around here. And so today we are diving into really what we would call, I guess, the first major church father. That would be this guy, Justin Martyr. Let me see what we got here. Let me see if I have any. Oh, here we are. This guy right here in all his glory. He was born in about the year 100, which means actually if you're keeping score in the year 100, you know, there's still apostles alive, right? Oh, I screwed this up. I screwed up my little screen when I did that. Hold on. Give me a second. Justin Martyr. Boom, 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 boom. There we go. Which means, yeah, he's still alive when probably a couple of the apostles are left doing their thing. The apostle John is known to have lived out the rest of his life in Ephesus. So he lived a long time. And so when Justin Martyr is born, John's still out there. Some estimates have the book of John's Gospel being written around the year 120. So when he's like 20 years old or so, the community of the Johannian community, John's community, is sitting down writing the Gospel of John. So he's right there at the start of it all. He's right there at the beginning. And by the way, if you have like questions and stuff, you can load them up in the chat, and then maybe we can get to them once we run through all the information here. So Justin Martyr probably knew people that knew the apostles. He probably had conversations with people that knew the apostles. And I love thinking about stuff like this.
Come stir.
That people are interacting with the apostles in the early church history, or maybe some kids who are growing up in the church, maybe their parents knew the apostles or sat in their feet and heard them teach, all kinds of stuff. Hold on a second. If you are just hopping in, if you want to like mute yourself there, I can just go like that and boom. And so that stuff like that, I love to think about how close these guys were to having conversations with the apostles and the work they were doing. So this guy is born in Palestine. He writes about his youth. He wrote this book called The Dialogue of Trypho. He wrote 3 books. We're going to talk about those 3 books. The first, the main one that people know of, that sort of lays out like sort of his story, is this book called The Dialogue with Trypho. Obviously, I'll explain what that is in a few minutes. But he writes about his early education and how he was really heavily into philosophy. He, of course, being from the Greek East, he was very engaged with philosophy. But the thing is, what he writes about is that he couldn't find anything when he was growing up that sort of that met his philosophical needs. He wasn't born into the Christian home or anything like that. He studied philosophy, and he was constantly unhappy with the things that he found with philosophy. Nothing was really meeting his needs. He studied under several different sort of schools of philosophy. The first thing he studied under the Stoics, and he decided after a while that the Stoics, that they really couldn't teach him anything about God. It was more about accepting suffering, accepting your lot in life, and finding meaning. And there's a lot more to it than that. But in his mind, this is sort of what this was about. And so he didn't really connect with the writings of the Stoics. And so after the Stoics, he tried Aristotle. And he had this teacher who, I don't know if it was some sort of scam artist situation, but this Aristotelian teacher that he had started making more and more demands of him. And as time went on, he was just asking for more and more money. And whatever it was that his teacher was doing, it rubbed Justin Martyr the wrong way. And at some point, Justin Martyr decides, if this guy knows so much about Aristotle and he acts this way, then I don't want anything to do with Aristotle either. So he walks out of Aristotle school. And then he goes into what's called Pythagorean philosophy. Pythagoras. And the thing about Pythagoras' sort of school of study was that it wasn't just about philosophy, it wasn't just about thinking. It was about music and geometry and astronomy and all kinds of whatever sciences they had at the time. And that was too much for him. He wasn't interested in any of that. All he's interested in is philosophy, trying to figure out sort of the meaning of life, the existence of humanity. Why are we here? And so at some point, let me read you a segment of his dialogue with Trypho. After that, he turns to Platonism. And here's what he says about Platonism. He says, the vision of immaterial things quite overpowered me, and the contemplation of the forms gave wings to my mind. And so after a short time, I thought that I had become wise. And I was so stupid that I expected to be able to see God quite soon. For this is the goal of Plato's philosophy. So when he started studying Plato, he had this thought that like he was finally going to find the way to God, that this is the way that he can finally figure out who God is, the divine being in the universe, the mind behind everything. And he decided that it was through Plato that he was going to find it. So he stuck with Platonic philosophy. He got way into that. And then one day, as a student of Plato, by the way, he's wearing the philosopher's robes, and he wore those his entire life. He never took them off. He wore the philosopher's robes so that you walk around, you would know who's a philosopher, and you would engage them in conversation, and they would be able to teach you. They're the wise gurus walking around, and you would be able to engage them in conversation and learn about sort of the meaning of all the things that you wondered about. That was their role in society. And so he's walking along the sea, and he's wearing his philosopher's robes, and a man strikes up a conversation with him, an old man who called himself a Christian. And this is a word he had never heard before. So he starts talking to this Christian. And he devises from the name that he studies the teachings of this man, Christ. And so he asked him about who Christ is, and they sat and talked about God and philosophy for a while. And the man eventually tells him that modern philosophers knew less about God than what he called the ancient prophets. And he encouraged Justin Martyr to study these prophets. And so when Justin Martyr walks away from this conversation with this old man on the beach, he suddenly has this huge thirst to find the writings of these ancient prophets, as this Christian called them. And he wants to find them, and he wants to see what they have, because apparently this old man knew a lot more about God than Plato did, according to Justin Martyr. And this man says he learned it from these ancient prophets. So this is what he says. He writes in his book, Dialogue with Trypho. He says, immediately a flame was lit in my soul, and I was seized by a love of the prophets. This is when he starts reading them. He says, and those men who are friends of Christ, that's the apostles. And whilst turning over his words in my mind, I found this philosophy alone to be safe and worthwhile. So that is why I am a philosopher. And that's what he says. He says he's a philosopher now because of Christianity. He says that's what helped him actually become a true philosopher, was Christianity. So he was converted through logic and reason, more so than miracles, than any experience. This man was converted through reason, the reason of the apostolic teachings, the writings. And around this time, probably all he would have gotten his hands on was, first off, he would have read the prophets. Those are readily available at all the synagogues. But as far as the early Christian writings go, I can't imagine he would have had more than maybe a couple of the writings of Paul, and maybe the Gospel of Mark. I don't think he would have been able to get his hands on Matthew. It wasn't really all that well circulated. So we don't know really what he was reading, but I'm assuming he read these ones. This is what the assumptions, we can make some assumptions about what was accessible at the time. And so this is sort of what turns him on to Christianity, and he becomes a follower of Jesus through reading these things. And so Justin believed that Christianity was a philosophy, like Stoicism, like Platonism, etc. And most Christians today wouldn't talk about Christianity as a philosophy, but some of the early church fathers actually did. This is what they believed it was. And his whole life, he always wore this philosopher's cloak, even everywhere he went. Even when he was preaching in the churches, he's wearing the philosopher's cloak. And his view of Christianity actually drew heavily upon Plato. And so what you're going to see if you read the writings of Justin Martyr, you're going to see this mix of Platonism and sort of first century Palestinian Jewish Christianity melded together. So he's going to bring in other ideas of the soul. He's going to bring in, like when you read about Plato's ideas of the soul, the idea that the soul was inherently eternal, that it existed both ways. Eternally, your soul always has existed and always will exist. Although most Christians now believe they sort of half this, right? They take the idea that it's a little more Gnostic. It's more like once your soul is born, your soul is born with the body, and then it lives on forever. But most Christians don't say it always has existed. This is likely what how the Platonists, if they came to Christianity, would have viewed the soul. Really interesting. This is not how the early Christians would have actually viewed the soul. Nevertheless, this is part of our story, part of our history of like people are coming in from different places. Augustine also came in from Platonism as well, and had a heavy influence on the Reformed movement, and really the church all the way through. Justin Martyr, let's talk about his writings. His writings were mainly focused, his main focus was to define Christianity. That's what he was trying to do. In its many sort of varied philosophical facets, he's trying to define Christianity to his philosophical opponents. That's what he's trying to do. Because here's the thing. In his day, Christianity was very persecuted by all kinds of people. And all the other philosophies are looking down upon Christianity, and they're frowning upon it for several reasons. I mean, they considered it a barbarian philosophy. They hated it. One of the main reasons was that they mocked Christianity for appearing to worship a human being. Okay. This was outside of the realm of ancient philosophies. You didn't worship any kind of human being. You worshiped an immaterial God, a God who had nothing to do, because in Plato's mind, the physical realm is evil. Your whole goal is to escape the physical realm and to fly away. And some Christianity is taught like this as well. There's a lot of segments of evangelicalism that says that the goal of Christianity is to save your soul and then separate that soul from the body after you die and fly away to somewhere else while all this burns, because the physical realm is evil. That is not Christianity. That's actually ancient Platonism, Gnosticism, all this stuff sort of mixed together. The Christians didn't teach that the soul, that the body was evil, but that it was created to be good, and that Jesus gave us sort of the perfect representation of what the human body was supposed to look like, how life was supposed to be lived in this world. And so a lot of Platonists especially mocked the Christians for appearing to worship a human instead of an immaterial God, because humans were physical and tangible, which made them evil. And so this discussion about persecution, this is what actually moves us directly into the discussion of Justin Martyr's views, not of philosophy, but of the empire and how Christians should live in the empire. Now, most of Justin Martyr's work can be couched in sort of reactionary ways. Like he is, all of his writings are responses, either to philosophy, to attacks by the Roman government, he's basically an apologist. He's always writing to defend Christianity. And so in Justin's day, Christianity was not recognized by the Roman authorities. It was not a recognized religion. You weren't validly allowed to be a Christian. And some of the emperors of Rome sought to stamp Christianity out. Now, I think I've talked about this before, but I'm going to say it again. When you talk about persecution of the early church, we tend to think that if you were to look at a map of Rome, that it's always glowing red with persecution. Like they're always persecuting Christianity and trying to stomp it out. But that's not entirely true. That's actually not true at all. What you would have seen if you move time forward and look at the map of the Roman Empire, there's going to be these little red sort of fires that start and go down and start and go down. And they're in different places all over the map as different leaders of Rome get angry with the Christians and decide to wipe them out in different areas. And so sometimes the Christians are going to move around to different places and trying to survive and just hoping that their emperor doesn't turn on them. Okay. This is actually how you can explain a lot of Paul's writings in Romans chapter 13, where Paul, tells them like, look, respect the people who are in charge over you. Paul, at this point when he's writing, believes that Jesus is going to set up his kingdom relatively soon. And so he's trying to buy some time and trying not to cause a revolt with the Jewish Christians against Rome. And so he tells them, respect the authorities that are over you. But at this time, he's under Nero, and he probably believed that Nero was going to eventually be a good king. This was before Nero became an evil king in his mind. So everything has context, everything has meaning. I think if Paul were to have written the book of Romans 5 years later, he would not have included chapter 13, I don't think. I don't think he would have said, submit to them and honor those rulers. I think he probably would have had other words to say. He probably would have come out against them as John did and called them the Antichrist and the dragons and the beast. But we're getting off track. Let's go back. And so one of the reasons the emperors were seeking to wipe out Christianity at different times was because the Christians were notorious for refusing to honor the traditional gods of Rome. They would not worship these gods. And so they were called atheists. Christians actually were the first people in history to be called atheists. They said, you're not going to worship Apollo. You don't believe our gods exist. You're an atheist. And so there were all kinds of rumors also spreading because of this about the Christians, about these weird atheists that are living amongst us who worship a human being and not this disembodied divine being. And some of the rumors were that at their church gatherings, they were having these incestuous orgies. That's one of the rumors that was going around. Another one of the rumors is that they drowned babies. They're talking about infant baptism. As a sacrifice. They're purposely taking everything that they did and misinterpreting it. They accuse the Christians of taking part in cannibalism. Now, where would they get that idea? The Eucharist. This is my body. This is my blood. Eat of it and drink of it. And so it was often very dangerous to go out into the public square and call yourself a Christian, because first off, they're going to be like, ew, you attend orgies, love feasts, and you drown babies, and you're cannibals. Like, you are disgusting people. And so these rumors were flying around about the Christians. And so part of Justin Martyr's work was correcting all these errors. He's one of the first main writers to do this, probably the first main writer to do this. So his first book is called The First Apology, a perfect title. You know what his second book was called? Second Apology. So in The First Apology, he argues that a person should be judged not by the rumors, not what people say about them, but they should be judged by how they behave, not what names they are given, not by what even they call themselves. That you should look at the lives of the Christians and judge them by the lives that they are living. This is obvious to us. We're, children of Dr. Martin Luther King, and we have people before us that pointed these stuff out for a very long time. In that day, you were judged by your association, who you were associated with, by your name. But Justin Martyr argues, no, look at the lives of the Christians. Watch how they live. And so he rebuts the charges of atheism, the charges of immorality, and by pointing at the way the Christians were living, he argues that the Christians in their day are far more virtuous than any of the pagans around them, if you will watch their lives. And he actually calls them to watch the lives of the Christians. And then you start seeing these writings by secular writers and secular rhetoricians who say, well, the Christians are living pretty weird. First off, they live opposite of us. You have like Dio Chrysostom, who says stuff like, Romans are stingy with their money and generous with their beds. But the Christians are stingy with their beds and generous with their money. They're opposite of us. And so you start seeing these ancient people taking notice, probably because of men like Justin Martyr, about the way the Christians are living. And they start to see that they're weird, that these feasts that they're having, these meals where they would have communion, don't just include people who are like them. They include people from all walks of life, as well as the wealthy and the poor, slave and free, Jew and Gentile. And this was bizarre to them because you would never do this, because the table was where you found your identity in society. And how can you share your identity with all these people? And so he also defended the intellectual coherence of Christianity. And he really seeks to do this in the Second Apology. So his book, The Second Apology, he continues a lot of the main themes of the first book, but he expounds on them a lot more. And he expounds upon about he expounds upon them really philosophically is what he does. So those are those two books. Those are available. You can read those. They've been translated in their honestly like $5 on Amazon, probably less, probably for free online a lot of places. And so you can read those. They're fascinating. I think his most important book was probably Dialogue with Trypho. It's a really long, it's a tedious book, but it's really long, and it's a dialogue modeled upon, he models the writings of Plato is what he's doing. He's sort of, it's a character sort of type kind of thing. It's a work of art. And it's modeled on Plato, and it's this dialogue between Justin himself and this guy, this Jewish philosopher named Trypho. And the point of this book was to write something that was rational and it was cordial, and it was sort of this back and forth that represented, that presented Christianity in this intellectually really coherent philosophy that put it on par with all the other philosophies. And so it's this really fascinating thing to read. It shows a lot of respect for other views, which was unheard of in those days. Not even amongst other philosophies did this happen. And so he puts Christianity, he paints it in a really like pleasant light. He paints Christianity up in a way that's really sort of cordial and respectful of other views and ideas. It's friendly. It addresses others respectfully. There's no vitriol. There's no contempt, which is something that a lot of later writers of Christianity, especially during the Protestant Reformation, they abandoned this way of writing. They're brutal and they're rude and they assassinate each other's character. They completely lack this sort of cordial way that Justin Martyr had. It was a very tolerant tone towards what he would even call a heretic. He was very cordial towards these heretics of the ancient world. And he's almost welcoming to them. He's welcoming them to the conversation and hoping that they stick around so that they can spend time with him and learn. Okay, so it's this totally different figure in the ancient world. So he addressed a lot of challenges. He addressed questions like, should the Christian faith be integrated into the liberal arts, which is a fascinating question. He didn't answer all of these. He brings up these questions and sort of pokes at them as if to say that probably they should. He asks if all truth is God's truth, and if God is Lord over everything, and if it's possible to address sort of science, then we can address science in faith, or should science be addressed apart from faith? And so he's dialoguing with a lot of this stuff. And he addresses also the central task of missionary outreach, which was huge in the ancient world because Christianity is just beginning to spread. And the question he tries to answer is, how do we incorporate the gospel into the native customs of indigenous peoples? He's way ahead of the curve of like trying to stop what we would later look at as colonialism. He thinks that Christianity can blend and meld into any worldview, any ancient way of living, and that Jesus can actually breathe meaning into all of it. And so he's way into apologetics. He's way into studying other world religions and interacting with them. He addresses the question, is Christ the only way? He addresses questions like, how does Christianity relate to other religions? All of this is in his writings. On top of that, the last thing I want to point out about his writings is that he wrote a lot of things that addressed ecclesiastical issues. In other words, ecclesiastical, that's the Greek word for ecclesia is the Greek word for church. And so he's addressing things like baptism, how baptism should work, what baptism should mean. And he brushes up against things like transubstantiation, which is the idea that does the body and the blood actually turn into, does the bread actually turn into the body of Christ? Does the blood actually turn into the blood of Christ? And stuff like this. I actually don't remember his answers. I've read so many of the church fathers that it becomes a blur. I don't remember what side he was on. He addresses the order of worship. He addresses the meaning of communion. All kinds of stuff like this. Baptism, he offers insights into baptism, all kinds of stuff. And I would argue one of the biggest things that you can take from the very first church father, Justin Martyr, is that you cannot talk about Justin Martyr unless you talk about his kingdom ethics. I think his kingdom ethics are probably the biggest thing that I have learned from Justin Martyr. It's the biggest thing that I think the early church for the first 300 years really held on to about his theology. So Justin Martyr, in his first apology, his first book, he's writing to try and appease and ease the fears of this emperor. His name was Antoninus Pius, was the emperor of Rome at the time. And he argues that the Christians, Justin Martyr argues to the emperor, that the Christians aren't a threat to the empire. And the reason they're not a threat to the empire, despite them saying Jesus is Lord, despite them not worshiping the gods of Rome, he says they're not a threat to the empire because their king is not a human one, an earthly one. Their king isn't present in the world right now. That their king was here but has ascended and cannot be seen. And so he tries to sort of ease the fears of the emperor and say, you don't need to attack them because I don't necessarily like the argument, but he's basically trying to save the lives of the Christians. He's saying because their king's not an earthly king, he's a heavenly king. And rather it's a kingdom that can't actually be seen. They're not trying to gain land and fly a flag and build an army. It's a kingdom which has already been inaugurated. It already exists here, and it will be revealed one day when Christ comes, but that's nowhere near the time of your reign. So they're not a threat to the Roman Empire. Now, this didn't really work. In chapter 39 of Justin's letter, in chapter 39, he sort of sets the tone for how the early Christians should exist. So he sort of turns to the Christians and he writes to them and says, here's how you should sort of live in the world amongst other kings and kingdoms. And he basically says that the mere attempt to live a normal life in the Roman Empire will be disrupted by challenges of loyalty. He says, so as Christians, as you are living in the world, and I think this is incredibly helpful for us today, as you are living in this world, your normal life as a Christian, living wherever you live, will constantly be interrupted and disrupted by challenges of loyalty. And you will constantly be asked the question, who are you loyal to? Where does your allegiance lie? Does it lie with Caesar or with Christ? Now, Caesar is the stand-in name for any ruler of human peoples. Any ruler, that wouldn't, I guess, count for local rulers like the mayor. It would count for rulers who have command over military forces and who use those military forces to sort of own land and protect that land. So he says, basically, Christians would find it impossible to serve in seats of parliament. He didn't believe Christians could serve in higher form seats of government because of the idea of ruling with violence. Justin was a known pacifist, as were all the church fathers of the first 300 years. They were known pacifists. And you will see this as you read. And one of the main problems with serving in parliament in that day, which I guess we wouldn't face today, is that they required these incantations and offering incense and sacrifices to other gods, other kings, other deities. And obviously the Christians couldn't do that because their allegiance was to Jesus. But modern scholars would point out that we still have things like the Pledge of Allegiance that require sort of your incantation of allegiance. And they would question these kinds of things. Christians might find themselves as well, in Justin's mind, the Christians would find themselves unable to buy or sell or trade in the marketplace, which was a right that was often accessible only after offering incense to God. So in the ancient world, you had these agoras. They were these sort of the malls of the ancient world. They were outdoor malls. Think Wiregrass. And these outdoor malls, these spaces where you would shop. But you couldn't buy or sell or trade unless you first went to the altar, which was a pillar about up to your waist, and it would be adorned with these statues of the god Apollo or just somebody else. And you would have to pay some money, buy some of the incense, right? You got to make money off everything. And you would offer this incense, you would put it on the altar and you would light it and you would offer incense to that God. The Bible even talks about a sweet smelling aroma to God, right? Like when we offer our sacrifices, sort of the smell of the cooked meat going up. And that this pleased the gods. And that's how the ancient Israelites believed the sacrifices helped as well. that it smelled good to God. And so you would offer these incenses to their gods, and then you would receive a mark on your hand or a mark on your forehead so that you could buy, sell, or trade in the marketplace. Think the book of Revelation. This was something that actually happened. John isn't writing about something that will happen in the future. He's writing about something that already happened, that was happening in that time. And so these are choices that Christians would have to make. And so Justin, in his pacifism, he describes the followers of Jesus. Let me read you his own exact words. He says, he defines Christians as, we who hated and slew one another, and because of customs would not share a common hearth with those who were not of our own tribe, but now, after the appearance of Christ, have become sociable, and we pray for our enemies, and we try to persuade those who hate unjustly, in order that they, living according to the good suggestion of Christ, may share our hope of obtaining the same from the God who is master of all. So he describes Christians as, we're just like you. We lived the Roman life. We killed people. We hated our enemies. We hated people who weren't like us. We weren't sociable. We hated our enemies. We wanted to slay our enemies. But after the appearance of Jesus, it changed how we view the rest of the world. It changed how we view everything. And he describes Christians as those people who view everything through the lens of Jesus, and who now run around trying to persuade other people to look at things through the lens of Jesus, which includes loving your enemies, being sociable, which was a huge thing in their day, praying for your enemies, persuading people not to hate others, but to love them, living according to the way that Christ lays out, and common hope of goodness and peace in the world. And so Justin considers the rejection of violence and the ability to forgive and pray for our enemies as one of the main marks of God's people. Which, if you were to ask people today, what is one of the main marks of God's people? They would say they're Christian. They call themselves Christians. They go to church. We'd ask them what they believe. Justin Martyr and many of the early church fathers, Justin Martyr especially, said that the ability to forgive and to pray for your enemies and to reject violence is one of the main marks of God's people. That's how you know the people are followers of Jesus. That is part of their unique identity in the world. And that stood out in the world. And so he quotes prophet Isaiah, whose words about who basically says things like, God's people will beat their swords into plowshares one day. They will not take up swords against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. And he says, this has now happened in light of the appearance of Jesus. This is what God's people have done. Isaiah said that God's people would do this, and Jesus has caused his people to do this. And so then he says, we who once murdered each other, indeed, no longer wage war against our enemies. Moreover, so as not to bear false witness before our interrogators, we cheerfully die confessing Christ. So he says, given the choice to defend yourself or die, we confess Christ and die. This is how he describes the actions of Christians should be. And so the implication here is that the church is a kingdom without weapons of war. For the church doesn't see war as a tool of any use to the world that they are working towards. In other words, Justin Martyr believed and taught that God's kingdom would enter into the world and did not require that a single person die because of it. And that's a huge idea, especially when you compare it with church history, when you compare it with Renaissance papal history, when you look at the popes during the Renaissance period, when you look at even the lives of the reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin, when they were first starting out, they were very loving of their enemies. They were very cordial and forgiving. But once they came into power, they tended to take part in the assassination of their enemies. They tended to, you see at the beginning of Luther's, when he's not wrapped up in the kingdoms of the world, at the beginning of his theological journey, Luther is talking about how much he loves the Jewish people and how we should show love for the Jewish people. But in the last 10 years of his life, he's writing books about how their rabbis should be killed and their houses should be burned and their synagogues should be knocked over and burned to the ground. There's a shift and a progression that happens, and Justin Martyr would say this is exactly what will happen when you join in with earthly kingdoms. This is how he viewed the world. So The very last thing I think I want to talk about before we sort of open all of this up to questions and stuff like that is Justin's martyrdom. You may have noticed his name is Justin Martyr, and we call people who die for their faith martyrs, and we get this from Justin Martyr. In the year 165, he was in a philosophical debate with a pagan philosopher whose name was Crescens, and he mopped the floor with Crescens. He absolutely defeated him. Crescens lost the debate, and everyone knew it, and he was humiliated. And so Crescens, like a good rich little boy, went to his parents' friends that were in authority, and he went and said, basically, this guy Justin Martyr's out there teaching pagan, forbidden religions. And so Justin was arrested, and his trial was very brief because Crescens was demanding that he be put to death for humiliating him in a philosophical debate in public. And so Justin Martyr was put together with 6 other Christians who had been arrested for their faith as well. And they were given one last chance to burn some incense and make a sacrifice to a Roman god before the courts. They all said no, and they were all scourged and beheaded together. And basically, Justin Martyr is seen as the archetype of Christians in persecuted countries ever since. The word martyr was permanently transfixed to his name as a way of communicating to all those who are preparing to suffer that they are in good company. People would, for the rest of their days, say, "You're about to become a martyr," which likens them to Justin. So that is the amazing, brilliant, wild, wonderful story of Justin Martyr, who challenges our sort of very way of understanding how to live in the world. So let me look into some of these questions we got here. What does he have to say about Christ as the only way? I do not remember. I want to say for him, it was probably wrapped up in his writings of Jesus as the only true King and Lord. In those days, the general idea was that Christians were those who rejected other kings and followed their king. And so if you were going to ask, when we talk about the only way, we're talking about the only way to heaven after you die. That theology had not quite come into fruition yet about everything. That's sort of papal and Reformation theology that made everything about heaven and hell when you die. For the Christians, it was about the early Christians. It was more about establishing the kingdom of God in the world. And so when you talk about is Jesus the only way, they're talking about the restoration of all things. They're talking about the kingdom of God being established in this world. And they would say, yes, Jesus is the true king, the only one who can set things to rights, the only one who is able to bring about true peace and righteousness in the world. And so he would fall on the side of yes, he is the only way. We like to ask questions of the Bible oftentimes, and the early church fathers, questions that they weren't dealing with. And so in the modern day, we have all these religions. We have Islam, we have Hinduism, Buddhism. The church fathers weren't engaged in those conversations. They didn't have Islam. I mean, it's from like the 650s, right? 7th century. They didn't have all these other religions to compare Christianity to. They had philosophies, they had other gods, and it was quite easy to say, those gods don't exist at all. Jesus stood before us and showed us who he was. He's resurrected. And so oftentimes we even make Jesus address questions that Jesus was not answering. When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's not addressing pluralism. He's actually, when he says, I am the way, he's literally saying, I am the law. He's literally talking in Jewish language that describes the way as, this is the way God's people are to live. We follow the law. He's talking about the Mosaic law. And Jesus says, if you're going to understand the law, you need to understand, I am the way. The way that the Jewish people would always talk about the way, the path. And to walk the path was to be God's children. God's children walk the path. And so if you wanted to remain in the covenant, you walked the path. And Jesus says, I am the path. Walk with me, and you're in the way. You're one of God's people. That's what he's saying. He's not saying Islam is not the way. That's questions that we can absolutely address and talk about, but that has nothing to do with what the Bible is talking about. Those are extra biblical conversations. So where are we at? So given the facts that Justin Martyr was assumed, the Justin Martyr assured Emperor Pius that the Christians were no tangible threat to the Roman Empire and believed that Jesus' return was far off in the future. Would you therefore classify him as a millennialist as to his eschatology? These are also terms which we try to interject into, Charles. These are terms which we are interjecting oftentimes into early theology. They did not really think of things in these ways. We've developed over the last 2 centuries, the last 2,000 years, all kinds of ways of talking about the end times, which include certain assumptions. The assumptions are that the book of Revelation is about the future, and that there will be one day a giant battle that God will rage and win, and will rapture all his people away, stuff like that. The early Christians didn't necessarily believe this. They didn't have these developed eschatologies, if you will. They were kingdom people. They believed the kingdom of Jesus was at hand, that Jesus was imminently about to reappear and establish his kingdom, and all other kingdoms would fall then and there. This is what the book of Revelation is about. He's writing to Christians in tribulation in Rome. They were already in tribulation. They already believed they were living under the reign of Jesus. And the point of that is to say, don't follow the beast. Okay. So it's, I don't think you could categorize him in that, as a millennialist in his eschatology. So who were Justin's direct successors? I don't know off the top of my head. But I'm going to try and do this chronologically. So I will address that in a future episode of Church History for Lunch. What would you say, Michaela, what would you say is the particular model or philosophy that was established by Justin Martyr that is reflected across other early church historians? Definitely his kingdom theology. Some of his Platonism stuck around. You can still see some of that. But his kingdom theology definitely stuck around. You can see it in a lot of modern Anabaptist theology, in the Hutterites, even maybe the Unitarians and the Mennonites. You can see this influence. They will regularly quote Justin Martyr, especially in his pacifistic writings. And they will, so the Amish are a form of Anabaptist too. And Anabaptists, they came around during the Reformation, but they are neither Catholic nor Protestant. They are their own people. And Amish people would be brought into this sort of tent as well. They are separatists. They believe, like Justin, that they are not part of anything going on in this world, that they're doing their own thing. A lot of my theology is heavily influenced by the Anabaptists as well, because I first off attended a Anglican/Anabaptist seminary, and I read a lot of Greg Boyd. If you know who that is, check him out, Greg Boyd. Okay. We got Chris Jordan. Did Justin ever renounce or consider some of his Plato-derived ideas? When were they addressed by other Christian writers? They weren't necessarily addressed, but some of these ideas are assumed to be true. It's, when you come into when you learn something new, you don't know what you don't know. By the time you get to Augustine is 300 years and 300 miles away from Palestinian Judaism, and he has no ability to interact with it unless he somehow gets a hold of like the Dead Sea Scrolls and reads them. He's not reading Jewish apocryphal writings and getting an understanding of what the Jewish people are doing. And so they're coming in from other religions, and they already have, when they read the soul, they already had ideas popped into their heads about this stuff. And so sometimes it's hard to decipher how many of them had a good understanding of the Jewish idea of the soul and how many of them didn't, and how many of them were working off their preconceived notions of Plato and then building off of each other. And even as you move through church history, at every turn in church history, everyone is reading Augustine, but they're all reading Augustine from their own time, and they're all coming to different conclusions on what Augustine is saying. And so you have the popes, and they're reading Augustine, and they're like, Augustine agrees, Augustine's on our side. And then you have Jan Hus, who reads Augustine and then comes up with an Augustinian theology that gets him killed by the popes. And then Martin Luther reads Augustine, and Zwingli's reading Augustine, and Calvin's reading Augustine. They're all coming to different conclusions because they're reading from their own time, and they're interjecting their preconceived ideas into what they're reading. This is what we do when we read the Bible, even today. When we read Romans 13, when Jeff Sessions stands up at a podium, when the rulers of the most powerful nation in the world reads Romans 13 and tells you to submit, he doesn't realize that letter was written from the bottom of the empire by a guy who's just waiting for the guy at the top to be thrown down by Jesus. So like he's literally reading, when the rulers of the world are reading especially Romans 13, they're reading a passage written against them that is contemplating their own demise. So this is what we do. We read into the things that we're reading. Greg Boyd, Myth of a Christian Nation. That was a great book. When he became the pastor of his church, what was this church called? I think it's in Michigan. Brian knows the name of it.
It's called Woodland Hills.
Woodland Hills. He became the pastor of that church, and it was like some 5,000 people, and he started teaching this series called The Myth of a Christian Nation, and whittled the church right down to 2,000. And then it grew back up over the years, and he's written a lot of books since then. He's a brilliant theologian. He's an Old Testament scholar. Okay. What time is it here? Let me see. Oh, good. We're good. Troy Osborne says, thoughts on his theory of illumination, for in the name of God, the Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. He's quoting here. For the name of name of God, the Father, and the Lord of the universe, and of our Savior Jesus Christ, and of the Holy Spirit, they then received washing with water. And this washing is called illumination, because they who learn these things are illuminated by their understanding. Yeah, he believed baptism was efficacious. He believed it actually tangibly did something to you. And a lot of Christians still believe this. And they point to, I literally was reading an article like 2 weeks ago that said something about how baptism, maybe in like a little longer ago. I don't remember when I read it, but it was not too long ago. They talked about how 70% of people who get baptized maintain their faith for the rest of their life. And a Catholic scholar chimes in and says, well, of course, because baptism is efficacious. It physically imbues you with something. That's what a lot of Christians throughout history have believed. I'm not against it. I believe God is present in it in some way. It's sort of like a sealing of like your identity, not just a joining into a community. And so I think there's something to think about there. He says, didn't he teach that communion caused our flesh and blood to be nourished by transmutation? Probably, yes. This was before all the debates about transubstantiation sort of had taken place, and people are coming to different conclusions. And so people weren't as divided by small theological issues in that day. They were readily accepting of diversity, as long as you maintained adherence to the creeds that are passed down from the apostles that would later be sort of solidified in the Nicene Creed. There's some of these creeds in the scriptures. Philippians chapter 2 is probably the longest one. And some of these creeds, I believe the one in 1 Corinthians can be shown to come to within 5 years of Jesus walking the earth. The Christians are, within 5 years of the crucifixion, Christians have these creeds that Paul is learning and passing down through his writings. This is one of the main reasons Paul is even writing, to preserve these creeds. So yeah, these things weren't as big of a deal as they are now. Nowadays, you can split a church by standing up and saying, oh, we want to baptize babies. And half your people will leave. Okay. In the ancient world, they're like, cool, babies too. Although by the 16th century, your view of whether or not babies could be baptized would actually determine whether or not you were drowned in the river by the Reformation leaders. The early Anabaptists, the founder of the Anabaptist movement, was baptized by Luther's followers for refusing to baptize babies. You want to know why? Why that was a big deal? I'll tell you why. This will be a tangent, but I think this is one of the most important tangents if you're going to understand church history. How do I start this? So in the ancient world, well, let's see medieval world even, not too long ago, 500 years ago. The government and the religion were the same thing, okay? If you were rejecting Christianity, you were rejecting the emperor. So every theological stance you took had political ramifications. If you were baptizing babies, you're creating, let's just put this in context of like Germany. If you're baptizing babies, you're creating good Germans that are allegiance to the throne of the emperor of Saxony or wherever you're at. If you were the Anabaptists and you refused to baptize your babies, what are you telling the emperor? You're telling the emperor, my child is not one of your citizens of your kingdom. And so if you didn't baptize your babies, you would be rounded up and you would be killed. So today we debate paedobaptism, children, baptism, baptizing babies. We debate this as if it's a theological issue. And we like to pretend that during the Reformation that it was a theological issue. It was not a theological issue. It was a political issue. And everything that Luther did was backed by the prince of the area in which he was living. And it would not have been successful. Luther's 95 Theses being nailed to the door of Wittenberg, we'll do a whole one on Luther at some point, would not have done anything had the Catholic papist government not been at the borders of Germany, right on the outside, taking money from the people in the form of indulgences. Indulgences was the idea that you could give money to the Catholic Church and you could buy your relatives out of hell, out of purgatory. Why was this important? Because there was a plague that was killing hundreds of thousands of people. And so suddenly everyone is very concerned about the souls of their loved ones who had died in the plague. And so the Pope comes up with this idea of selling indulgences and sends people out to collect money to sell this indulgences to let you get, what he's really doing is raising a bunch of money for the Pope, getting rich. And the prince, I forget his name. If you know the name of who was prince over Luther at the time, I think it was started with a G. The prince over where Luther was living at the time did not want his money going south to Italy from Germany. And he was losing money constantly. And so when Luther puts this thing on the door of the Wittenberg church, this was the prince's chance to turn against Rome. And so he takes Luther's writing and he has somebody copy it and translate it into German from Greek and pass it out to everyone there and start the Reformation for political reasons. The Reformation did not start for theological reasons. We like to tell the story that these men were standing there with pure biblical intentions of the heart, and sometimes they were. When Luther stood there at the what's called the Diet of Worms, where they're demanding that he recant his books or die, Luther stood there and said, I will never recant my writings. These are theological writings, and this is who I believe God is, and here I stand. And he almost was killed for that. That was a theological move right there. He put his life on the line. But this thing did not start for theological reasons. It started for political reasons, for power and for money. And the truth is, they were looking for somebody to use to break off from the papacy. The German government at the time wanted so badly to keep their money and break free of Rome. And Luther was the excuse that they came up with. And this happened over and over and over and over because there's this woman, Catherine of Siena. Catherine of Siena said 200, it was 100 years at least before Luther, said everything that Luther said. And no Reformation happened. She wrote it all in her books. Every single thing that Luther argued was written by Catherine of Siena 100 years earlier. But first off, nobody cares because she was a woman. Second, nobody cares because it was not politically expedient at the time. This is what caused the Reformation. Jan Hus as well said the same things 30 years earlier. That was a tangent. But that's how you can understand the debates of paedobaptism. Rarely theological. Even today, they're rarely theological. They're more about identity, tradition, tribalism. Once we can get past, the reason church history is important is because once we can see everywhere we go wrong, once we can move past all this, we can start the unification process of the church. I believe that one day God will unite his Catholic and Protestant and Anabaptist brothers and sisters. I believe this will happen probably hundreds of years from now. But I believe this is probably part of the plan, to reunite, as the Nicene Creed says, one holy and Catholic and Apostolic Church. With that, I'm out of time. I didn't get to all your questions. I'm really sorry. Oh, but it looks like you were listening. That was church history for lunch on steroids. I think we covered 1,500 years. We jumped around, though. And I'm having fun. Next week, I'm going to take a week to do some seminary work, and one of our elders, John Thomas, is going to jump in. He's going to talk to you about Ignatius of Antioch. Brilliant Latin writer, church father. So he's going to do that. And so thank you all for joining me. It's been a lot of fun. Have the best Thursday of your life.